This video will provide an overview to reshaping data. By the end of this video, you should understand what we mean by reshaping data, and you should know two important dplyr verbs for reshaping data. Through your data wrangling process, you may find that the data that you have is not in the format that you want. Different applications of data mean different arrangements of your data. Further, the data format may depend on the way it was collected. Often this means you need to reshape your data. What do we mean by reshaping? You're going to take data that's in a tidy format and rearrange information in rows and columns to create a new tidy data set. Reshaping data can be complicated and sometimes a little error-fraught. This video will cover the concepts of reshaping. We'll dig into the details in future videos. So let's look at an example of reshaping data. Suppose you were given this table of non-tidy data. Why are these data non-tidy? You can see that the level variable contains information on both relative humidity and temperature. This violates tidy data principles because we're holding two types of information in the same column of our table. What we might like to do is rearrange this table so we have a month column, a day column, a temperature column, and a relative humidity column. Converting your data to something like this format is exactly what reshaping data is. But let's think about precisely what's happening here. What I'd like to do is rearrange my data so the month column and the day column are preserved. I take that first piece of information, relative humidity of 61.67, and I put it in a column called RH in my output table. On that same row of my output table, I'd like information from the second observation of my source table, the temperature of 5.46. For the next day of my data, I would again like to take the value for relative humidity, the 93.75, and put that in an RH column corresponding to month 1, day 2, and likewise include the temperature information for month 1, day 2 as well. And then I would do these exact same things for the third day of the month, again pulling the relative humidity information from one row and the temperature information from another row. So what exactly happened in this example? We took a table with 6 rows and 4 columns and converted it into a table with 3 rows and 4 columns. Information in the level column was spread out into the temp C and RH columns, and information from the measurement column was used to make those new column names. The new data were wider or shorter than the original. You're going to do this in dplyr using the pivot wider verb. As of dplyr 1, this replaced the spread verb. So frequently, if you search for help on the internet, you may see the spread verb. Pivot wider is much easier to use and much more flexible. The important thing to remember is that pivot wider is always going to make your data shorter and wider. Let's consider another alternative. Suppose you were given this table of data with the highest temperature recorded in each year for 2 different cities, New York and Los Angeles. Why aren't these data tidy? Again, these data don't meet tidy data principles because we're storing the same type of information in several different columns. Each of the 3 max T columns just contain the maximum temperature for a particular city. That's one type of information, and we prefer to record that in a single column. So how might we make these data tidy? You could imagine creating a different table of data where there's a city column, a year column, and a maximum temperature column. The first row of that new table would contain information from the New York row of the input table, and the first column, the max T 2000 column. The second row of this output table would move to the second column of that first row, recording that 95-degree high temperature. And the third row of the output table would have information from that third column of temperatures. You then repeat this process with the Los Angeles row of the table, starting with the first, then going to the second, and then moving on to the third column. So what happened in this example? We've taken a table that had 2 rows and 4 columns and converted it into a table that had 6 rows and 3 columns. Information from those max T columns were gathered up into a single max T column, and year information from the variable names was converted into a new data column called year. The resulting data were narrower and longer than the original. You're going to do this in dplyr with the pivot longer verb. As of dplyr 1.0, it replaced the gather verb. Just like with pivot wider and the spread verb, pivot longer is easier to use and much more versatile than gather. You may run into gather when you search for help on the internet, but pivot longer is the preferred method. The important thing to remember with pivot longer is it's always going to make your data narrower and longer than your original data. This is an overview of reshaping data. We'll dig into the details of using pivot wider and pivot longer in subsequent videos.